What'd you say? Oh, okay. So we're on. Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to the reading of my master's thesis. My name is Nontokozo Tshabalala, and I was part of the MFA program in design 2020, which is, of course, why you are here. I don't know if I said I'm from South Africa, and I'm gonna basically read through my thesis. Thank you very much, Micah. I'm gonna read through my thesis and kind of take you through what it is that I wrote about and my project called Melanin Spaces. Um, so I will start now. This is very awkward because I'm recording a podcast for the very first time, and I have all these lights everywhere and all these microphones everywhere. So it's a little bit strange. And also, I'm talking to myself. Like, it's a whole other level. But I'm going to break this awkwardness of mine straight into how I've divided my thesis work, which is part of the project Melanin Spaces. So I have 3 or 4 chapters within the thesis work. And the first part of it is the design research question and the background introduction. So basically just mapping out what it is that I get my oomph. Those who know what oomph is will understand where I get my oomph from. And I'll lead into the designer and her skin, mapping the manifesto, which I'll share with you later as well. And then the politics of visibility. And the last will be being, which is my contribution through practice and the practice that I have, which is design. So my background is in communications design, basically graphic design from the University of Johannesburg. And so I enter my thesis work with that perspective of being very visual, but also being expressive with the work that I want to work with. So at this moment, I'll take you through the background. The questions that I wanted to ask in the thesis, or rather throughout the time that I had in order to focus on my my project and my thesis, was the question of what is the role of the social designer in making people of African descent visible in a segregated city such as Gothenburg. And Gothenburg is, basically one of Europe's most segregated cities, which is was kind of a shock for me when I first read about it. But coming from South Africa, that's something that's like not too surprising, I guess, in terms of the space. But being in Europe and having to understand what segregation looks like within the space is a whole nother concept. So, as I said, my main question was, what is the role of the social designer in making people of African descent visible in a segregated city? And the sub-questions that follow that is, how can space occupation be a tool for self-empowerment and healing? And what methods are needed for that? Can a design system transform the way in which the people of African descent infiltrate the predominantly white city center? And how does the occurrence of structural reluctance hinder the process of the African identity from belonging to or occupying spaces? What is the relationship between identity, decolonization, and design practice? So the keywords within my whole work is decolonization, social design, space and places, structural violence, identity, racism, representation, and intersectionality, and also collective healing. The first part that introduces my body of work is a poem I wrote called Here I Stand, and I will read it for you now. There's something about standing in front of this building. Its gray, high walls telling of a time I never knew I was part of. But here I stand, in front of it, seeing a reflection of myself in a darkness that painted me as I am, but forgot the minor details of my presence in its carvings. My journey undocumented and silenced in textbooks. My rituals celebrated through mockery. My bare breast so accurate you can see how I gave life to this place, to your modernity. What more do I have to say when your history repeats itself on my body? In forms I can't explain, so I shout instead. I shout in rebellion through my loud voice, my foreign tongue, and my brown skin every day. Your segregated cities and thoughts testify to your unwillingness to cooperate with dignified human rights laws, and your iron fueling the exchange between rage and survival in foreign lands. Your sweet nothings painting your innocence, but here I stand, in front of it, as I am, wondering if the past has brought itself back or that it has always been here. I think my mic is falling down, so I'm just gonna adjust it real quick. There we go. The gray building mentioned, oh, listen to that. The gray building mentioned above is the Transatlantic Headquarter building established in the 1940s on the French lot. A trade between the Swedish and the French for a Caribbean island called Saint Bartholomew in 1784. Two among a few reasons, colonize and become part of the commercial and transatlantic slave trade. It contains reliefs designed by artists turned sculptor Fritz Bange between the years 1942 and 43, depicting very happy and jolly looking indigenous people from parts of Africa. Why is that spike falling? I think it's good. No, it's not good. Maybe I balance it there. Thank you. Thank you very much. But it looks like it's still like, okay. Maybe do that. And then turn it here. And then tighten it here. Please don't fall. So it contains reliefs designed by artist turned sculptor Fritz Berger between 1942 till 1943, depicting very happy and jolly looking indigenous people from parts of Africa, Asia, Hawaii, etc. On the sides of it, and particularly on the flagpole near the building. A depiction that leaves me with many questions, but the biggest being, why is this still here? It is the same way Temi Odemuso, in her paper, talks about her encounter with images and depictions of historic black-brown people in Denmark. She describes them as anachronistic racial motives that seem to her entirely out of place in a modern and progressive city. These depictions are somewhat neglected and exposed. This made me think of the Afro-Swedes, or just people of color in general here in Gothenburg. They seem to be around and but rarely seen. And a quote, actually, that I found was, being an African in Sweden is to be exposed. And this was a reading of a Google translation version of a title from the Afrosvenskarna Riksförbund website. This exposure talks of a certain vulnerability which exists in extreme power societal dynamics embedded in racism, and my personal favorite, color blindness. A part of me wants to believe these images are not meant to be so violent because they celebrate the building and area in which Sweden's history of trade is most profound. However, something a little deeper leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. I assume it's the constant update of yet another brown person who has been beaten by police or security personnel, or a brown man who has died in hospital from a lack of attention, or maybe even the image of the current state of Hamakulan. The feelings I am exposed to are all too familiar. Even here, as the depictions stare with an artistic flair, one where the designer or artist cannot be anything but fundamentally well-intentioned. This is a quote by S.A. Canal and Luisa Prado, 2016. Even with all of that, it still feels problematic. This relationship between artist, material, and society makes me question my role as a designer. With these well-intentions, how are these images of myself adding or taking away from how a segregated space like Gothenburg portrays me and interacts with me? Taking into account that by me, I mean we. And this is in line with Dr. Maya Angelou's words, I go forth alone, but stand as 10,000. In this space, I stand as an Afro-Swede, African, minority, vulnerable woman exposed to both racism and sexism. A point of many intersections that somehow all have to work together in creating a safe space of being, of existing. Yet the very space I occupy deems me invisible, even on walls. These many layers ultimately put me in place to see myself and my role as a social designer These many layers ultimately put me in place to see myself and my role as a social responsibility rather than a burden. It provides different perspective to looking at the work I do, which is grounded in identity, race, representation, and being conscious about the type of spaces we occupy, be it abstract or physical. For example, one of my projects called Afrofuturistic Thought as Minimalism, which I designed in 2018 as part of the program, was aimed at creating images or posters of everyday brown people in Gothenburg for primary school kids in a predominantly brown and so-called dangerous, quote, dangerous area called Biskopsgården. And this is also where I lived. And this was in order to see themselves in a different light than which society shows them. This project established my awareness of Gothenburg as a segregated space, allowing me to grasp the duality of my presence in forms of the intersections described previously. Viska Prata, which is another project that I did last year, was a t-shirt protest that looked at the brutality from police and security personnel towards the Afro-Swedish community. This allowed me to build a network of stakeholders in solidarity of the project. Viska Prata forms base for this particular thesis work. It started by looking at how to use mere observations of how people interact with the park, Brunnsbacken, near a very commercial space, which is Nordstan. What followed were a series of standstill protests responding to the everyday movement of the space in effort to disrupt the peace by obstructing the walkway. During the preparation for the project, I quickly realized that if I were to protest using the South African method of protesting, which basically means being on the street and chanting and basically making noise, because sometimes that's the only form of help that you can, or the only way you can ask for help sometimes. I realized that this wouldn't be necessary. This wouldn't necessarily work due to the type of society, in this context Swedish, I was now situated in. So context also matters quite a lot when establishing this role of a social designer, which I have not fully just accepted yet. According to the Social Design Methods menu by Lucy Kimball and Joe Julia, there are 7 habits in which social design situates itself in. Tell stories, make maps, work at human scales, and connect across networks and people and things. Look at both the detail and the bigger picture. Make things to explore, test, and learn. Imagine scenarios of use, provoke, and inspire alternatives. Make the unfamiliar familiar, and vice versa. Focusing on the way people actually do things rather than the way they say they do things or think they do things. I agree with most of these points in reference to my work, whether this has been conscious or not. My role is in some way made evident because of my intention to focus on the social benefit for people of African descent. My testing and exploration has taken place over different projects with different social settings. In a quote by Manzini and Rizzo, the social in social design depends on the ideological and practical background of the researchers involved and how this definition in turn is reflected in design projects. I believe Kimball and Julia, I just said that in the quote. I actually believe them. They only mention 7 habits of what a social designer is because they have not been clearly established or maybe even decided upon because of the vastness in which the designer can formulate ideas and methods of working for themselves. When looking at the way in which Temi Odemusum navigates her presence in the Western world and uses her work as a tool in exploring how art mediates social transformation and healing, she provides a fundamental aspect to the role I envision. If anything, healing is by far what my work aims to offer, and I believe it's important to feed it into the role of a social designer in this context. In the social design methods menu by Kimball and Julia, the duo provide methods and modes and methods of engaging in social design for a project or service, namely exploring, making sense, proposing, interrogating, and interrogating. In these modes, different questions are asked to assess the outcome of the idea. I believe these can be used, however, healing is of the essence, particularly in the context of being viewed invisible. It then becomes an overarching concept in developing systems of frameworks for societies. Could then these modes of working be built and molded to provide frameworks for healing? The aim of Melanin Spaces is to develop a system or framework with methods and tools for the newly developing admin group, which is now called the organizing group of Melanin Spaces, which has no foundations as yet. So the time when I wrote the thesis, we hadn't decided on a name, but within the written work, I decided to call it the admin group. So you're going to hear the admin group quite a lot, and you will meet them in the 4th chapter. This fresh start allows space for self-determination developed by the individuals of African descent who make up the group. I have taken the past 4 months to plug into the group at the hopes of developing a system or framework that enables the African identity to physically occupy spaces of exclusion as they work in mobilizing potential members. This is in hopes of redefining narratives, decolonizing and occupying space that represent a silent violence and continue to make us visible. And that's the end of the background. This work will be shared much later with the zines being available at a much later stage. And so there's a manifesto that we put together at the end of at the end of the visit, where we asked a fundamental a fundamental question of why are Melanin Spaces important, and we asked each member within the group to mention why they were important. And the manifesto that I'm about to read to you is a compilation of all of those points that were raised by the people who attended. We, the highly melanated, we belong, accepted. We aspire, and we will exist on our own terms. We will have fun. We will heal. We will enforce love for our individual selves, but most importantly, love for our people. Our history is important, and we will occupy every corner in Gothenburg. We will build out today, build out tomorrow, and build with intention. This manifesto, I used it to also map out my thesis work And so within each part of the manifesto, I highlight certain points that feed themselves to the rest of my thesis. And that's where the titles called The Artist and Her Skin, Politics of Visibility and Just Being come from. Because there's this constant need of having to ask to just exist, which is quite annoying, frankly. But again, it is there. So the manifesto is just to affirm that we're here and we're not going anywhere. So I'm going to take you through the second chapter, which is the design on his skin. And this is what I mentioned as mapping the manifesto. So it's design and identity in the quest for decolonization. So within the artist and his skin and basically mapping the field of which I work in, I tried to create a few zines, all sort of detailing different parts of my work. And so I'll take you through the first part of the work and just understanding the different elements that make up me and why I want to basically tackle the questions that I want to tackle. So reads as follows. This zine aims to take you through a series of projects, artists, movements, writers that make up my research landscape of social design in the context of decoloniality. I highlight some methodologies and practices that assist in articulating my interests. I will begin this research by acknowledging the individuals I have been mapping my practice against. Dr. Renata Marquez Leitaho, I hope I'm saying it right. She describes herself as a social change-focused design researcher. The work I closely relate to is that which is represented in the paper, Culture as a Project, Design, Self-Determination and Identity Assertion in Indigenous Communities. This was written in 2017. The work was part of her 5-year-long participatory doctoral research. And I look at this from the lens of cultural project as means of community empowerment and identity assertion. Temio Dumuso is a dynamic art historian whose research and cultural practice is focused and concerned with the visual representation of African people, Afro-diaspora, and aesthetics, as well as how art mediates social transformation and healing. And I look at her work as experience as a reflection point of engaging with design, art, and history. And then a good friend of mine by the name of Veronica Odetunde. She's a model, poet, and creator of Black Our Story and Black Her Story, an event celebrating Black History Month, which was held in Blostelet, Angeret. Both events took place, yes, in Blostelet. She forms part of my exploration on space occupation, and I will explain my interaction with both of those events at the time. So I look at her work through event planning as means of space occupation. And then there's Fanando Nobe. She's a lecturer, activist, and writer of Svart Kvinna, a book where she compiles the everyday experience of sexism and racism that Black women face in Sweden. And with her work, I look at publication design as means of story collection and collective healing. And then I had the honor of being part of the Afrofeminist movement. Let me not say movement, but there was an event that had happened in Belgium, and it was organized by the Mwasi Collective, which is an Afrofeminist activist made up of women, non-binary women who identify as Black and of Afro descent. And looking at them, I thought about the idea of a collective as a tool for implementing effective change amongst those with common identity and social issues. I remember the day where, for the first time, I realized I was living in a segregated city. A project I had been working on that particular month had me on the streets of Gothenburg, chasing any Black person who would give me the time to explain why I had been looking, to take photographs of them. One day I was standing in the middle of Kungsports Avenue, Is that even a thing? Yeah, Cook's Fourth Avenue. When I realized why it was so difficult to find black people, I was looking at the wrong place. At the time, I lived in Biskopsgården, and it had never occurred to me that the closer I got to home, the browner the faces became. So one day, I began taking trams in different directions just to observe. And so I will read you two poems from those moments. The first one is called Number 11, and this was written last year. I love the Number 11 tram to Bergen. It's not as quiet as the ones in the city. In here, people are of many origins, but the spirit is one. It's not confusing or repelling or quiet and violent. Multiple conversations all happening at once. Different tongues at the peak of their lungs. Deep conversations interlocked in eye contact, passionate hand gestures outlining the plot. Yeah, this is the kind of life I want to see. And this is the life for me. The next poem is called It's a Little Too. It's a little too pale, a little too cold, a little different, a little odd, a little too damn silent, a little too same, a little too fancy, and a little bit too disco dancey. So those are two poems that I wrote that kind of emphasize this journey of being in those trams. My encounter with this realization raised many questions about the visual cues I had been overlooking in the city, Gothenburg. What else had I been exposed to but never taken note of? During the artist talk, Eric Magasa presented his work for Gigba as part of the Lambeth Gothenburg Biennale in 2019, I believe. There was a building that caught my attention, which was the Transatlantic building, which I mentioned in the poem in the beginning, in which his work was in direct conversation with. During the presentation, he spoke about how he had learned about a colonial history Sweden shared with Africa and Saint Bartholomew, a history that wasn't pleasant enough to be taught in schools. And this is also, a few people have mentioned this. So therefore, he began to ask his own questions through his work. So the work of Eric Magasa uses the collage of old and new photos, of using old and new photos and juxtaposition. And these photos are relating to Africa. And he uses solid shapes and lines and patterns to have the conversations that he wants to have within the work. And this was very beautiful, and it was right across this very peculiar building that I wasn't so sure of. And you can check out the work on the Gigba website. So my concern with the relationship that the visual culture shares with an identity and its history is one many other scholars, especially from marginalized groups, continue to address. I believe that it is because of our own quest to find who we are that any intentionally placed artifact of contemporary white ignorance stands out like a sore thumb. It actually literally hurts. So within this particular zine, I also show different works of different artists who have basically explored what this journey of like identity and visual symbols within cities and what it means to kind of engage with them from a visual level. And as I said, one of them is Temiodo Musso, and she wrote this beautiful article which was called Open Images or Open Wounds, Colonial Past and Present in the City of Copenhagen. And throughout the essay, she kind of pinpoints these little images, maybe not so little because they affect us, that occur in like grocery stores, in bookshelves, coffee with indigenous people depicted on them, drinks called Lynchburg, which is basically like a blood red drink, different Apple brands, you name it. People were having fun here. Anyways, so one of the things that she highlights is the Circle Cafe girl. She says it was one of the first of many visual assaults that wrought havoc with my emotions and senses. Whilst the months and years ensued, her ambiguity as a design motive within a largely homogeneous European culture agitated my embodied sensibilities. As a scholar who works on race and representation, but more directly as a black woman commencing the slow and gradual project of dwelling in a new city, attempting to make the unknown and unfamiliar into something approximating home. And that's what Temi says. And I guess in the same sense, I also share these sentiments with her. Addressing these images means having to look back into history while at the same time reflecting on the present. The relationships that these images have with each other are of significance because they maintain a narrative that not only alienates my understanding of self, but now the understanding of self in the Western context. And within the thesis, I show the depictions of different women from different parts of the continent that are on Yantoriet. And some of these things, when I see them, I'm just like, okay, guys, like, seriously, why are we not seeing this as problematic? And why haven't they moved, even after so many conversations that have been had about how problematic they are still kept there. And so, yeah, that just remains an issue for me. And so I say addressing these images means having to look back into history while at the same time reflecting on the present, which is me walking on the street, me looking at these images, me experiencing racism and other people experiencing racism, and just seeing how these symbols remain untouched and unprovoked. So there's a quote by Henning Langrut, which is part of Aesthetics and Communication, and it reads as follows. The symbolic language of images has an inherent ambiguity, with different levels of meaning. Images of all kinds, symbols, and allegories are, where memory is concerned, affect for many reasons. One of them is their aptitude for rhetorical concentration of being able to compress a large amount of content into one expression. These images echo themselves in, and that was end of quote. These images echo themselves in time, carrying with them a collective memory of both multi-generational victory and so-called multi-generational so-called victory and pain, so-called pain. They are placed in public areas for happy consumption. Only when these images are confronted with a post-colonial critical gaze do they activate themselves into society. So this makes me think that who are the people who are looking at them and who are engaging with them and not seeing anything problematic with them? And they just remain ornaments within the city. But once somebody who understands what they do, where they come from, and how they activate themselves in society, only then does it become, only then does the art activate itself within society. And I find this particularly interesting. Memory takes place in time and in a temporal activity. Something of the past is activated in the present with the perspective. It is a recollection of truth that eternally is. And that is a quote by Watt. So within the essay as well, I go through different works and movements that I looked at. And one of them is I'm probably saying it wrong because it's French, but Noir es en français contre Zwart-Piet, which is basically a protest against the tradition of a Zwart-Piet. And the organization had put out a statement saying that we want people in France to understand why we're against this, and that our culture and who we are is not a costume that can be put on when people feel like it and when they feel like consuming us. But that these are lived realities that people go through on a daily basis. And so basically they showed solidarity to the movement and to the people of African descent within the context of the Netherlands. And I carry on. I believe that these bring about what Odumuso calls retro-racism, which she got from Matthias Danbold, that has legitimized the demeaning of non-white bodies as pleasurable commodities. I mean, all this is important because racism is a violence that pervades the body. And this was a quote by Natalie Figueiredo. And so when looking at these violations of the body in the current state of affairs, they are present through racial profiling, Afrophobia, racial discrimination, both in colonies and colonial homelands, such as Sweden, France, United Kingdom, and of course the list goes on. Within a film that I also looked at, which is Les Miserables, the Tom Poyton writes a short description of what's happening there. So imagine France is the context of prolonged social unrest. Les Miserables inevitably draws comparison to 1995's La Haine, described by one commentator as its mirror. La Haine followed 3 young men of Maghreban descent stuck in Paris city center one night, having missed the last train home due to having been stopped by the police. By way of reflection, Les Miserables follows 3 policemen patrolling But why am I reading so much French also? Oh my gosh, this is hilarious. Patrolling Le Bosquet housing project in Montfermeil on the edge of Paris over 2 fateful days. 25 years on and nothing has changed in France. The liberal assumption of progress is shown as hollow and empty in a country divided between a metropolitan elite and those excluded, literally pushed away to the margins of the city, left with little to nothing in the way of infrastructure or meaningful opportunities, regularly told they are not enough French by dint of their religion or culture and subject to racism. And so when looking at all of these narratives and looking at all of the work that's been produced in order to address this presence of Africanness within the continent of Europe, it draws me more into understanding what the social, not the social, but like what the context is within Sweden. So that was the end of the quote. And so with all of that being said, it is important to separate the artist and her skin. The two contain lived experiences that form intersectional points where design and blackness continually meet. This intersection comes with its own understanding of self, space, urgency, and future. Exploring the relationship between the place and identity deepens our understandings of identity formation and the role of place in social and psychological development. And that's a quote by Jen Jack and a lot of other people. So how then do the roles we play in society influence design education and the way we see design as a social responsibility? Being able to look beyond aesthetics and principles. how do we contribute to society in the most meaningful of ways? I believe that social design enables for this articulation to happen. The following are quotes from different people who have spoken about their roles within the art, within social design as well. So, according to social design methods by Lucy and Joe Julia, there are 7 habits, which I mentioned earlier as well, which social design situates itself, which were the telling of the stories and making maps and juxtapositioning, provoking, inspire, and just altering reality. So with that, Manzini and Rizzo mentioned that the social within social design depends on the ideological and practical background of the researchers involved and how this definition in turn is reflected in design projects. I believe Kimball and Julia only mentioned 7 habits of what social design is because they also have not been clearly established or maybe even decided upon because of the vastness on which the designer can formulate ideas and methods of working for themselves. There's also a notion that the social design puts emphasis on design-based practices towards collective social ends rather than predominantly commercial or consumer-orientated objectives. This can be contemplated because all work is consumer orientated and gets consumed one way or another. And I believe this is a primary objective for all art and design work. Maybe not in the capitalistic way, though. However, the conversation then becomes what is more important for that particular project at that time, and where does the social designing actually take place? I'm just looking at time and all that I've also written within the work. I will take you through multiple other projects that I'll just mention them. I looked at a jumpsuit collection that Andre 3000 created. And he had these jumpsuits every time he was performing with different things written on them. And one of them was across culture. One of them that was written was across cultures, darker people suffer the most, and why? Which I think is an absolutely relevant and beautiful question that we need to pose everywhere we go. And so I also looked within the work and trying to map out these things. I also looked at how objects show solidarity to movements, to this conversation of the collective struggle. And so I looked at different movements from different parts of the world, which I will not mention a lot of, but one of them was the Black Lives Matter movement, of course. And so within this pool of things that I am in and looking in, social design is one of the most highlighted, I guess. African identity, graphic design practice, activism, lived reality, and space. And so where do all of these meet, and how do I articulate that space where they meet? So I'm going to read the second part, or rather the third part of the essay, which is the politics of visibility. And I'll just read the basis of the project and then kind of take you through the last bits of conclusion. So Melanin Spaces, which is the project that I created, is a collective project between the members of a group that initially wanted to create a Gothenburg branch of the Afro-Swedish Riksförbund, but are in the process of deciding on it. And actually we have formed into an organization called Afro Institution. So, for namesake, I will refer to them as admin group because that's what I wrote within my thesis. So the project aims to physically get people of African descent to occupy spaces of exclusion within the context of Gothenburg, which is one of Europe's most segregated cities. The project maps out places in which members of the AD group feel particularly unwelcomed and aims to host meetings, workshops, free tours of the space and other activities in order to break through the psychological barrier resulting from the effects of segregation, which manifest themselves through socioeconomic issues relating to race and sometimes even class. In parallel, the project also serves as an exploration of the role a social designer in the specific context of Gothenburg is able to bring about mobilization of individuals of African descent together using space occupation as a method for collective empowerment and healing, at the same time reclaiming these spaces of exclusion for themselves. The body of work engages with different points of the timeline, a timeline which I have put together of the work that I had been engaging with from the beginning of my studies, which was part of the Afrofuturistic thought as minimalism, which I did when I just arrived, but then branching off straight through to what Melanin Spaces is now. So I said it lands itself in the last 4 months of the thesis work. The project ran through a 4-month period and was divided into 3 phases, which was called Arrive, Plant, and Establish. Each phase consisting of reflection points on what the role of the social designer is and can be. The work closely analyzes itself in relation to Dr. Renata Marquez Leitaho in her study Culture as a Project, Design, Self-Determination, and Identity Assertion in Indigenous Communities. As a practicing designer and scholar, she uses design tools and strategies to build connections between design and the social well-being of people of the Akamwak community through the social innovation, identity assertion, and empowerment. These tools are evident in the methodologies I have applied in conducting the 3 space occupations that we had done, where the main goal is to enable the individual who exists in a whole to join a group of other individuals to self-determine their role in white Swedish society at their own discretion. My role as a social designer in the forming of the group was one that organically made itself present, in the sense that the group allowed for all individuals to mention what they were looking to bring to the table, as well as what they were looking to get from the team. And so the members were Desiree, Ida, or Isato, Ismaila, Aaron, Pluva, and Vera. I will leave that part of the politics of visibility because I just look at all the different parts of my projects that I had been working with, and all of them explore the same conversation of like, what is blackness within this context of Sweden, and what does it mean to assert yourself in the society? What does it mean to be deemed invisible? And basically, just asking the questions that I ask myself, but I use my practice to articulate the feelings that I get. So within the work, I had also done different questionnaires, asking different people from different origins questions around like what's their skin color, what's their profession, ethnicity, race, which is something the Swedes invented, their age, and all sorts of different questions in order to map out the audience that was engaging with me and also engaging with the work that I had been doing. And so the outcomes are vast, and I will not go through them, but we'll share them at a later stage. And so with that, what will I do? Let's see. I will not go through the different phases of the project, but I will say that tomorrow we are doing a space activation within the site that we're on right now. Again, to our own discretion, to do whatever it is that we feel like we want to talk about and do within the space. And so, if you are a person of African descent watching this right now, you are welcome to come through. Do go through on the Facebook, what's this called? Event, and just click going, and then we'll sort you out. But it's going to be a separatist event, so that's what's going to happen. But for time's sake, and for the sake of just sharing my project, which I will actually carry on with after this week, because I will share all the things that I've written within my work, how I've explored it, the findings and everything that I worked through in a different space and within the master's portal of the university. So for now, I don't know what I do, dear ladies and gentlemen. Do I just say peace out, drop the mic, which is cramping my hand, or or what happens now? Well, we're done. Thank you. Peace. My thumb. It's literally deformed. Ah.